Hello and a very, very warm welcome to my YouTube today. My name's Chris and today I'm taking a look at Robert Henry Cain. He was born in 1909 in Shanghai, China. He was the son of Robert James Cain and his wife. And they originally came from the Isle of Man. His parents returned the family back to the Isle of Man when Robert was young. And he was educated at King's William College, and following his schooling, Robert began working for the Shell Oil Company. He joined the Honourable Artillery Company, a unit of the Territorial Army, which allowed him to continue working for Shell. He was placed on the Supplementary Reserve List on the 12th of February 1931. By April 1940, shortly after the start of the Second World War, Cain was given an emergency commission into the Royal Northumberland Fusiliers as a second lieutenant. In 1942 he was seconded to the 2nd Battalion, South Staffordshire Regiment, before temporarily promoted to the rank of Major in April 1943, a position he would keep until being honourably granted the rank in 1945. The 2nd Battalion, South Staffordshire Regiment, was part of the 1st Air Landing Brigade, which landed in Sicily in July 1943 as part of Operation Ladbroke. In the same month, Cain took command of Battalion B's Company. And it was on the 18th of September 1944 he was commanding B Company. The 35-year-old Major flew to Arnhem with the first lift, travelling in a Horsa glider from RAF Manston. However, they'd only been airborne for 5 minutes when the tow rope became disconnected from the Albemarle tug, causing the glider to stagger. While the tow rope coiled up and lashed back at them, the glider made a safe landing in a field, bumping over the rough ground and ripping through a fence before coming to a standstill. Cain described it as a terrible anticlimax and said how the glider pilot couldn't believe his luck, as exactly the same thing had happened to him on D-Day. Major Cain and his men then flew out to Arnhem as part of the second lift on the following day, the 19th of September. Upon landing, he immediately set out to find B Company, who were presently moving forward to help the 1st Para Brigade, but he wasn't able to resume command until late on the following morning, when they were involved in vicious fighting in a dell around the area of the St Elizabeth Hospital. The South Staffords were being heavily attacked by tank and self-propelled guns, but they weren't able to bring up any anti-tank guns to repel them. Mortars were effectively being fired at point-blank range upon German infantry, but the Staffords had to rely on the Piat anti-tank gun to deal with the armour. Lieutenant George Dupont kept several tanks at bay with his Piat, while Major Jock Buchanan and Cain drew a lot of enemy fire by running around searching for ammunition. Cain did not believe that any tanks were actually disabled during the action, but the hits did encourage them to withdraw. Even firing at the turrets with Bren guns forced them to move. The Piat ammunition ran dry at 11:30, and from then on the tanks had a free rein over the area and proceeded to blow the defenceless troopers out of the buildings they occupied. Lieutenant Colonel McCarty came to see Major Cain and ordered him to withdraw from the dell. As they were talking, Cain recalled seeing an entire bush being blown clean out of the ground. Putting down a rear guard of about a dozen men and a Bren gun, the company withdrew from what Cain later described as the South Staffordshire's Waterloo. However, only himself and a handful of other men succeeded in escaping. On Friday the 22nd, his eardrums burst from the constant firing, but he continued to take on any tanks he encountered, contenting himself with merely stuffing pieces of field dressing into his ears. Nevertheless, he never ceased to urge his men on, and was seen by his driver, Private Granger, giving a man his last cigarette. Monday the 25th saw very heavy fighting in the area, occupied by the Lonsdale Force, self-propelled guns, flamethrower tanks, and infantry took a great interest in Major Cain's position. But by this time there were no Piats available to the Major. Undeterred, he armed himself with a 2-inch mortar and added further trophies to his collection, while his brilliant leadership ensured that the South Staffords gave no ground and they drove the enemy off in complete disorder. By the end of the battle, Major Cain had been responsible for the destruction and disabling of 6 tanks, 4 of which were Tiger tanks, as well as a number of self-propelled guns. As the division was about to withdraw, some men were encouraged to shave before crossing the river. Determined to leave looking like British soldiers, Robert Cain found a razor and some water and proceeded to remove a week's growth of beard from his face, drying himself on his filthy blood-stained Denison smock. His efforts were noticed by Brigadier Hicks, who remarked, "Well, there's one officer at least who shaved." Major Cain happily replied that he'd been well brought up. When the actual evacuation was taking place, Major Cain remained on the north bank until his men had departed for the other side. However, when it came to his turn, there didn't seem to be any boats left in operation. He and some fellow men caught sight of a damaged assault craft in the river, and they swam out to collect it. Using their rifle butts as paddles while other troopers bailed out the water that was threatening to sink them, they made the crossing back across the river. Major Cain's conduct throughout was of the highest order, both in terms of his personal actions and leadership ability, and for this he was awarded the Victoria Cross, the only man to receive this medal at Arnhem and live to tell the tale. His citation said of him, "His coolness and courage under incessant fire could not be surpassed." He was gazetted on the 2nd of November 1944, and after the war he journeyed to Norway with the 1st Air Landing Brigade and Divisional HQ to oversee the German surrender. He then returned to his pre-war occupation with Shell, living in the Far East and later West Africa, before returning and retiring to the Isle of Man with his family. Could I say a heartfelt and warm thank you, all the new subscribers? It would be really appreciated if you haven't subscribed, if you could. It really helps share the film around. It gives me some encouragement to keep making these films, which I think are finding a sort of a niche in the historical aspect of various parts of the Second World War. Please have a ponder. It would be very much appreciated if you did subscribe, and I thank you for that, really, from the bottom of my heart. Thank you. It's interesting to look back as early as the last days of the Battle of Arnhem, between the 23rd and the 25th of September 1944. The inhabitants of Arnhem were ordered by the German occupiers to leave the city. Arnhem became a military zone, meaning that the civilians were no longer allowed to stay in the city. Anyone who did and was found was mercilessly shot. The Germans then systematically plundered the empty houses, and much of the loot was sent to Germany for the inhabitants of German cities who had lost their homes as a result of the bombings. Finally, on the 12th of April 1945, the British 49th West Riding Division, supported by Canadian armoured units, invaded Arnhem from west of Wood. After 4 days of heavy fighting in the city, also around the square, the Allies took the entire city, and Arnhem, which was abandoned and ransacked, was finally liberated. When the war ended in May, the inhabitants could go back home, but in practice some of them had to wait months before they could do so. It would take many, many years to rebuild the city back to some resemblance of its early glory. I thought it would be rather interesting just to listen to some of the interviews that former servicemen who served or knew Major Robert Cain, where they talk a bit about the whole experience and of the person himself, Major Robert Cain. I think you'll find it really quite interesting.
On the Monday, it was the final day of the battle, and the Germans, that was 9th SS Panzer Division, have been trying since the Friday to break Major Cain's block, because that was the key to cutting us off from the whole division off from the river, and we would have been finished. We all knew that. I mean, it was obvious to us all. but he made sure that they didn't get through, to his great credit.
His action had tremendous impact on the troops as a whole and probably helped them keep their resolve and help win the battle out of proportion to the size of his own personal command.
It was the most wonderful example to everyone.
A major firing at tanks is something you don't hear of, really.
We all wanted to emulate him, of course, which we tried to do to our best ability.
The effect that Major Robert Cain had on the men was obviously his leadership and the fact that they were on the defensive, but he was moving, he was showing himself, he was rallying where there was the greatest danger. And that has the most huge impact upon people who have just got to stay there and endure and be brave. They need something to focus upon. He was that focus.
He led by example completely. I mean, I'm sure that whoever got back over that river of the South Staffords could owe that fact to Bob Cain. Nobody else, because it was his example that rallied them.
I sincerely hope this film has been of some interest, although it is quite short. But it's been a very, very interesting research, very, very interesting to put together, partly because my father was involved in the invasion up through Northern Europe, Belgium, Holland, and then eventually into Bremen. He was serving with the 13th and 18th Hussars, who were operating the Sherman Firefly tank. But please take the greatest of care. I thank you for watching along and look forward to seeing you on the next one. All the very best. Cheers.